2 Kings chapter 9. We want to go through our outline of the book real quick. The first 11 chapters of 1 Kings, because we've outlined 1 and 2 Kings together. Chapters 1 through 11 of 1 Kings is the reign of Solomon. The beginning in chapter 12 of 1 Kings and going through 2 Kings 17 is the divided kingdom. And then in 2 Kings 18 through 25, we're going to have the fall of Israel and Judah recorded for us. We're also studying 2 Chronicles. We've outlined it into two major sections. 1 to 9 is the reign of Solomon. And then chapter 10 through chapter 36 is the kings of Judah during the divided kingdom. But 2 Kings chapter 9, we're still in the divided kingdom at this point. And we're fixing to have a change in the family that is ruling in Israel. If you remember last week, as we were in the first 10 verses of chapter 9, Jehu is appointed the next king of Israel. That continues on beginning at verse 11. So let's hit 11 through 13 real quick. This connects back to what we talked about last week. Now Jehu came out of the servants of his master, and one said to him, "Is all well? Why did this mad fellow come to you?" And he said to them, "You know the man and his talk." And they said, "It is a lie. Declare it to us now." And he said, "Thus and thus he said to me, Thus says Yahweh, I have anointed you king over Israel." Then they hurried, and each man took his garment and placed it under him on the bare steps, and blew the trumpet, saying, "Jehu is king." So he was anointed king last week in the early part of chapter 9. And then 10 or 11 through 13 is when he comes back to the others that were with him when he was called aside to be anointed as king, and they asked him what happened, and he told them he was anointed king. And so they began to talk about, or to blow the trumpets and to shout, saying, "Jehu is king." But I want us to go back on something in chapter 9 from last week, because this is important for the rest of our study this evening. In verse 6 and 7 it says, "Thus says Yahweh," I'm looking halfway through verse 6. "Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, I have anointed you king over the people of Yahweh, even over Israel. And you shall strike the house of Ahab, your master, that I may avenge the blood of my slaves the prophets, and the blood of all the slaves of Yahweh at the hand of Jezebel." So Jehu is told in verse 7 he needs to do what? Strike down the house of Ahab. So this man comes to him. He's being told that he needs to strike. One of the sons of the prophets that was with Elisha comes and tells him what Elisha sent him to tell, and says, "The Lord said you need to strike down Ahab." Why is it the family, or Ahab's family? Why is it Ahab's family must be struck down? Because of their sins. Here's what they've done to the prophets, all that Jezebel and Ahab did to the prophets, and the family is to be struck down because of it. That's important because beginning now in verse 14 through 29, he's going to kill Jehoram and Ahaziah. Now, we talked about this last week. This is where the lines start to get confused. Because if you remember last week, we read about the death of Jehoram. But that's Jehoram of Judah. That's Ahaziah that's in this chapter's father. This Jehoram that is killed in this chapter is Jehoram of Israel. That's Ahab's son. So, Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, conspired against Joram, also known as Joram, either one. And now Joram, with all Israel, was guarding Ramoth-Gilead against Hazael, king of Aram. But King Joram had returned to be healed in Jezreel of the wounds which the Arameans had struck him when he fought with Hazael, king of Aram. So Jehu said, "If this is your mind, then let no one escape or leave the city. Go declare it in Jezreel." Then Jehu rode in a chariot and went to Jezreel, for Joram was lying there. Ahaziah, king of Judah, had come down to see Joram. Now, remember this. Ahaziah, king of Judah, that comes down to see Joram, why would he come down to see him? What's the connection there? Ahaziah is Joram's nephew. Athaliah, that we'll read about later on, is Jehoram of Israel and Ahaziah of Israel, who reigned before Jehoram's sister. They're children of Ahab and Jezebel. Athaliah married Jehoram of Judah, and Ahaziah of Judah, that's in this text, is Jehoram of Judah and Athaliah's son. So this is his uncle. Joram, or Jehoram of Israel, is the uncle of Ahaziah. So as Jehoram of Israel has come back recovering from his wound, Ahaziah comes out to see him. Ahaziah comes out to be with him. And it said in verse 17 that the watchman was standing on the tower in Jezreel when he saw the company of Jehu as they came, and he said, I see a company. And Joram said, take a horseman and send him to meet them, and let him say, is it peace? So a horseman went out to meet him and said, thus says the king, is it peace? And Jehu said, what have I to do with peace? Or have you to do with peace? Turn behind me. And the watchman declared, saying, the messenger came to them, but he did not return. And for time's sake, we'll skip on down a few verses, but the same thing happens again. They send out another horseman. He comes. He asks Jehu, is it peace? He says, what have you to do with peace? Turn behind me. That one turns behind. And finally, the watchman says, basically the same thing happened again, but this is Jehu. He's driving in madness. And so it's the driving of Jehu, the son of Nimshi. So they realize who it is. And so Joram, in verse 21, got ready and made his chariot ready. And Joram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, went out, each in his chariot. And they went out to meet Jehu and found him in the property of Naboth the Jezreelite. Now it happened that when Joram saw Jehu, he said, is it peace, Jehu? And he answered, what peace? So long as the harlotries of your mother Jezebel and her sorceries are so many. So Joram turned about and fled and said to Ahaziah, there is deception, O Ahaziah. And Jehu drew his bow with his full strength and struck Joram between his arms. And the arrow went through his heart, and he crouched down in his chariot. Then Jehu said to Bidkar, his officer, lift him up and cast him into the property of the field of Naboth the Jezreelite. For I remember when you and I were riding together after Ahab his father, that Yahweh lifted up his oracle against him. Surely I have seen yesterday the blood of Naboth and the blood of his sons, says Yahweh. And I will repay you in this property, says Yahweh. So now lift him up and cast him into the property according to the word of Yahweh. So here, Jehu strikes Joram or Jehoram of Israel with a bow, and what does he tell him to do with his body? Put it on Naboth's property. Remember in 1 Kings 21, keep your finger here in 2 Kings 9, but 1 Kings 21 is the story of Naboth's vineyard. And in 1 Kings 21, and in verse 19, it says, and you shall say to him, thus says Yahweh, have you murdered and also taken possession? And you shall speak to him, saying, thus says Yahweh, in this place where the dogs lift up the blood of Naboth, the dogs will lick up your blood, even yours. Also in verse 13, is where they had made the accusation against Naboth, and he had been killed. And so it's told to Ahab there that the dogs will lick up your blood. And you remember when Ahab died, they bring him back and they clean out the chariot, and his blood was licked up by the dogs. And Jehu says here, because of the word of the Lord and what was said about Naboth's vineyard, throw the body into the vineyard. And so he throws it into the vineyard according to the word of the Lord. And then Ahaziah, the king of Judah, saw this and fled by the way of the garden house. And Jehu pursued him and said, strike him down too in the chariot. So they struck him down at the ascent of Gur, which is in Ibleam. But he fled to Megiddo and died there. Then his servants carried him in a chariot to Jerusalem and buried him in the grave with his fathers in the city of David. Now in the 11th year of Joram, the son of Ahab, Ahaziah became king over Judah. So here, Ahaziah is pursued by Jehu and killed. Again, why is it, we know why Ahaziah came, but why is it that Jehu has to pursue Ahaziah? Remember the family connection. He's to destroy the house of who? Ahab. Ahaziah is Ahab's grandson. So part of destroying the house of Ahab requires destroying Ahaziah along with Joram. So Jehu says to pursue him. They strike down Ahaziah, and then he's taken and buried with the kings in the city of David. But not only was he to take out Ahab, the rest of the sons of Ahab, who else was he to take out? He's to take out Jezebel. And backing up into verse 8, it says, "For the whole house of Ahab shall perish, and I will cut off from Ahab every male person, both bond and free in Israel. And I will make the house of Ahab like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha the king of the son of Ahijah. And the dogs shall eat Jezebel in the property of Jezreel, and none shall bury her." Then he, the son of the prophet, opened the door and fled. So he needs to take care of Jezebel. Well, beginning at verse 30 and going through verse 37 then is where we have Jezebel killed. Jehu came to Jezreel. That's exactly where it said, by the way, where he's told that the blood of Jezebel is going to be licked up. So he comes to Jezreel, and Jezebel heard of it, and she painted her eyes and adorned her head and looked out the window. As Jehu entered the gate, she said, "Is it peace, Zimri, your master's killer?" Then he lifted up his face to the window and said, "Who is on my side? Who?" And 2 or 3 officials looked down at him. And he said, "Throw her down." So they threw her down, and some of her blood was sprinkled on the wall and on the horses, and he trampled her underfoot. Then he came in and ate and drank, and he said, "Take care now of this cursed woman and bury her, for she is a king's daughter." They went to bury her, but they found nothing more of her than the skull and the feet and the palms of her hands. Therefore they returned and declared it to him, and he said, "This is the word of Yahweh, which he spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite, saying, In the property of Jezreel the dogs shall eat the flesh of Jezebel. And the corpse of Jezebel will be as dung on the face of the field in the property of Jezreel, so they cannot say, This is Jezebel." That prophecy spoken by Elijah, that Jehu said has come true here, is also found over in 1 Kings chapter 21. It's said in the same speech to Ahab, at which Ahab was told that the dogs were going to lick his blood. That's found in 1 Kings 21 and in verse 23, where it said of Jezebel, "Also has Yahweh spoken, saying, The dogs will eat Jezebel in the district of Jezreel." I want you to think about for just a second this prophecy that was made concerning Jezebel. When Elijah speaks concerning her, back in 1 Kings chapter 21, quite a bit of time has passed. Several years. Many years have passed by the time we come to this point. And when when Elijah, speaking for the Lord, said that what was going to happen to her, he mentioned 2 very specific details that we find taking place here. What were those 2 specific details? The dogs would eat her body. There'll be the skeleton remain after her body. So he told what was going to happen to her body after she died, but Elijah also told where she would die. She was going to be eaten by the dogs in the property of Jezreel. When Jehu here comes and finds her, he, by the way, has already been told earlier in this chapter where is he going to find her, or where's she going to die? The property of Jezreel. He goes to Jezreel to find her. He comes there. She's in this tower. He asks who's on his side. 2 or 3 officials look out. He says, "Throw her down." They cast her down. She's trampled underfoot by the horses, eaten by the dogs, all in the property of Jezreel. You can't help when you read details like this to think about the fact of the details that are recorded that come to pass. I mean, you think about the fact that it is specifically told what would happen to her body and where it would happen. Not just that Jezebel would die, but it was told that she would be eaten by the dogs after she died, and that it would be in Jezreel. That shows us it has to be that Elijah was speaking by the Lord because of the intense details that came to pass. Because you can't just simply guess that she's going to be eaten by dogs and die in Jezreel. And it shows us that he was speaking as a prophet of God, and that shows us something about the power of prophecy, that those details are recorded for us many years earlier. And when we come here to the death of Jezebel, that's exactly what takes place. Is she dies in the property of Jezreel and is eaten by the dogs, so you don't even recognize, and no one could say, this is Jezebel. Well, after he finishes with Jezebel, there's still a lot more work to be done. So Jehu is going to execute Ahab's sons. Now Ahab had 70 sons in Samaria, verse 1 of chapter 10. And Jehu wrote letters and sent them to Samaria, to the rulers of Jezreel, the elders, and to the guardians of the children of Ahab, saying, So now, when this letter comes to you, since your master's sons are with you, as well as the chariots and horses and a fortified city and the weapons, look for the best and fittest of your master's sons, and set him on his father's throne, and fight for your master's house. But they feared exceedingly greatly, and said, Behold, the two kings did not stand before him. How then can we stand? And the one who was over the household, and he who was over the city, the elders and the guardians of the children, sent word to Jehu, saying, We are your servants. All that you say to us we will do. We will not make any man king. Do what is good in your sight. So as he's talking to them here, he sends word to them in Samaria and says, Appoint someone of your master's house to the fittest of your master's sons to be king and basically come in opposition to me. But what are the people of the city? How do they respond? They're afraid. The response is, two kings couldn't stand against him. What makes us think that we're going to stand against him? So they tell him, send word to us, whatever is good in your sight, whatever you say, that's what we're going to do. So then he wrote a letter a second time saying, If you are on my side and you will listen to my voice, take the heads of the men, your master's sons, and come to me about this time tomorrow at Jezreel. Now the king's sons, 70 persons, were with the great men of the city who were rearing them. Now it happened that when the letter came to them, they took the king's sons and slaughtered them, 70 persons, and put their heads in the baskets and sent them to him at Jezreel. Then the messengers came and told him, saying, They have brought the heads of the king's sons. So he said, Put them in 2 heaps at the entrance of the gate in the morning. Now it happened in the morning that he went out and stood and said to all the people, You are righteous. Behold, I conspired against my master and killed him. But who struck down all these? Know then that nothing from the word of Yahweh, which Yahweh spoke concerning the house of Ahab, shall fall to the earth. Indeed, Yahweh has done what he spoke by the hand of his servant Elijah. So Jehu struck down all who remained of the house of Ahab in Jezreel, and all his great men and his acquaintances and his priests, until there was no survivor remaining for him. Then he arose and came out and went to Samaria. On the way, while he was at Beth-Eked of the shepherds, Jehu found the relatives of Ahaziah, king of Judah, and said, Who are you? And they said, We are relatives of Ahaziah, and we have come down to greet the sons of the king and the sons of the queen mother. Then he said, Take them alive. So they took them alive and slaughtered them at the pit of Beth-Eked, 42 men, and he left none of them. Then he went from there and found Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, coming to meet him, and he blessed him and said to him, Is your heart right, as my heart is with your heart? And Jehonadab answered, It is. Jehu said, If it is, give me your hand. And he gave him his hand, and he took him up to the chariot. Then he said, Come with me and see my zeal for Yahweh. So he made him ride in his chariot. And he came to Samaria and struck down all who were left to Ahab in Samaria, until he had destroyed him, according to the word of Yahweh, which he spoke to Elijah. As you go through the rest of the story here, after Jehu has called out to the leaders of the city, and they've said, in those first 5 verses, tell us, what's good in your sight, and that's what we're going to do. He says, well, then take your master's sons and kill them and send me the heads. What do the people do? They do it. They kill them. They cut off the heads and they send them to him. And then after he has them in the heaps of the city, he says to them in verse 8 that, I conspired against my master and killed him, but who struck down all these? Know then that nothing from the word of Yahweh, which Yahweh spoke concerning the house of Ahab, shall fall to the earth. What's Jehu saying here in verse 10? He's saying everything that God said was going to happen to Ahab's house, that's exactly what's going to happen. He said, nothing that he spoke concerning Ahab, the house of Ahab shall fall to the earth. Indeed, Yahweh has done what he spoke by the hand of his servant Elijah. He said that the house of Ahab was going to be destroyed, so what's going to happen? It's going to be destroyed. Nothing that the Lord said is going to fall to the earth. What he's really, in reality, saying is everything the Lord said is going to come to pass. So, any of the descendants of Ahab he finds remaining, he kills them. Then he's on his way to Samaria, and he comes to Beth-Eked. There he finds the relatives of who? Ahaziah. So, here's the relatives of Ahaziah, king of Judah. Again, Ahaziah, king of Judah, is what relation to Ahab? It's his grandson. So these people, these are the household of Ahaziah, are relatives of, are going to be relatives of Ahab. And so he strikes them down. But then he comes in 15 through 17, and he meets with Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, and he makes a statement in verse 16. After he takes Jehonadab and brings him into his chariot, what does he tell him? Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord. One of the things about Jehu, and we'll see more about this later on, is to me, Jehu may be the saddest story of all the kings of Israel. For this reason, he was the closest thing that Israel had to a good king. And he gets off to a really good start as a king. The Lord said, here's what you need to do. And he says, I'm going to do what the Lord said. In fact, he talks here in verse 16 about the zeal he has for the Lord. In fact, that's going to be carried on here in 18 through 33 now. When Jehu gathered all the people and said to them, Ahab served Baal a little, Jehu's going to do what? Serve him much. Going to get what he's doing here is he's trying to get them together. So now, he says in verse 19, summon to me all the prophets of Baal, all his slaves, all his priests. Let no one be missing, for I have a great sacrifice for Baal. Whoever is missing shall not live. But Jehu did it in cunning. He's saying to the people, listen, you thought Ahab was good about serving Baal. He served Baal but a little. I'm going to serve him a lot. Tell everybody to come, and anybody that's a servant of Baal that doesn't come is not going to live. But why is Jehu doing this? He's trying to get them all in one place to destroy them. He's doing it cunning. Get them all here. Jehu says, sanctify a solemn assembly, verse 20, for Baal. And they summoned them. And Jehu sent throughout Israel, and all the slaves of Baal came. So there was not a man left who did not come. So they came into the house of Baal, and the house of Baal was filled from one end to the other. Then he said to the one who was in charge of the wardrobe, bring out garments for all the slaves of Baal. So he brought out garments for them. And Jehu came into the house of Baal with Jehonadab the son of Rechab. And he said to the slaves of Baal, search and see lest there be here with you any of the slaves of Yahweh, but only the slaves of Baal. Then they came in to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings. Now Jehu had placed for himself 80 men outside, and he had said, the one who permits any of the men whom I cause to come into your hands to escape shall give up his life in exchange. Now it happened as soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, Jehu came to the guard and to the royal officers, come in, strike them down, let none come out. And they struck them down with the edge of the sword, and the guard and the royal officers threw them out and went into the inner room of the house of Baal. And they brought out the sacred pillars of the house of Baal and burned them. They also broke down the sacred pillar of Baal and broke down the house of Baal and made it a latrine to this day. Thus Jehu destroyed Baal out of Israel. So here he gathers all the people in one place. And aside from getting them all together and saying, we come together to serve Baal, he tells them when they get there, they need to look out for who? Make sure there's not who there. Any of the people that are going to be serving the Lord. We don't want any of those that are serving the Lord here. Their thought is probably running through their mind, he doesn't want any false worshipers of Baal here among us. In reality, what's Jehu doing? They're making sure that people don't get in. But if somebody does, he wants to make sure when they get there, make sure you look around and you don't find any false servants. Because if you find any of them, we're going to get rid of them. Well, when they get rid of them, the people of Baal, the servants of Baal, are probably thinking what? He's just trying to make this great service to Baal. He's trying to save from having any false worshipers here. But what he's doing is he's sparing those that are servants of God. He's making sure they're not there, so when he destroys the servants of Baal, that's all that's present. So he gets them together, and they offer the sacrifices and the burnt offerings, and he's got these men placed outside, and he tells them, anybody that escapes, that is, anybody that is, I'm going through and we're killing the people inside, anybody that tries to escape, kill them. And if you let them escape, your life is required for theirs. Well, so they began, and he tells them to come in and strike them down, and they strike down all the worshipers of Baal. And they brought out the sacred pillars of the house, and they burned them. They broke down the sacred pillars and broke down the house of Baal. And he got rid of Baal worship in Israel. Now, I wish we could stop right there and then have it say that he slept with his fathers, and that would be the end of the story of Jehu. Because then we could talk about how good a king Jehu was. How much good he did in Israel. And he did do a lot of good. But he never brought them all the way back to serving God. However, verse 29. And that's a sad word here in the story of Jehu. However, as for the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel sin, from these Jehu did not depart. Even the golden calves that were at Bethel and that were at Dan. And Yahweh said to Jehu, because you have done well in doing what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart, your sons of the fourth generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. But Jehu was not careful to walk in the law of Yahweh, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, which he made Israel sin. And in those days Yahweh began to cut off portions from Israel, and Hazael struck them throughout the territory of Israel, from the Jordan to the east toward the sunrise, all the land of Gilead, the Gadites and the Reubenites and the Manasseites, from Aroer, which is by the valley of Arnon, even Gilead and Bashan. That's a sad ending to the story of Jehu. As we'll come down in verse 34 through 36 and have the death of Jehu. But here's this man that talks about everything that the Lord said about the house of Ahab is going to come to pass. Not a word spoken is going to fall to the earth. Here's the man that says that, come and see my zeal for Yahweh. Here's the one that makes sure when he's destroying the worshipers of Baal that those that are serving God are out of there and safe. And when all is said and done, he doesn't get rid of the golden calves at Dan and Bethel. He's probably the best king by far that Israel had. But he wasn't a good king. He wasn't the king that brought them back to serving God. He let his guard down, and he had to know about all the words that were spoken. I mean, this wasn't somebody that just didn't know anything about the Lord. This isn't somebody that seems to have just blatant disregard for everything God says, because when God says, here's what you need to do to the house of Ahab, that's what he does. And in fact, God said that, his sons of the fourth generation shall sit on the throne, because he listened to the word of the Lord when it came to the house of Ahab. But he didn't follow the Lord with his whole heart. And he didn't depart from the sins of Jeroboam. And so, Jehu wasn't the only good king in Israel. He instead fell along the lines of everybody else that was a wicked king. Now the rest of the Acts, verse 34 of Jehu, and all that he did, and all his might, are they not written in the books of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And Jehu slept with his fathers, and they buried him in Samaria. And Jehoahaz his son became king in his place. Now the time which Jehu reigned over Israel and Samaria was 28 years. Now because of what Jehu did, he will have the longest lasting family lines in Israel because it's constantly changing. But if he'd have followed through with serving God, who knows how many generations the Lord might have allowed to sit on his throne. But he came so close, and yet in the end, he never came all the way back to serving God. He never brought Israel all the way back. He got rid of Baal, but he kept the calves at Dan and Bethel. Yes, he followed after Jeroboam and in worshiping those golden calves. Now, chapter 11, we have the only queen in either kingdom. And that is Athaliah's reign over Judah. Now, Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, which is also, who is she, besides the mother of Ahaziah? That's Ahab and Jezebel's daughter. She saw that her son had died, and so she arose and caused all the royal seed to perish. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him from among the king's sons who were being put to death, and put him and his nurse in the bedroom. So they hid from Athaliah, and he was not put to death. So, here, the rest of the royal seed is to perish. Athaliah puts to death the rest of her family, putting to death her family line. She wants to make sure that she's got the throne. But Jehosheba, which is the daughter of Joram, which is Ahaziah's sister, takes Joash, Ahaziah's son, and hides him. By the way, Jehosheba is not only Ahaziah's sister. In Chronicles' account of this, and for time's sake, we'll note this rather quickly, Chronicles' account notes of Jehosheba that she is married to who? The priest. So we're going to read here about Jehoiada the priest. That's Jehosheba is married to Jehoiada the priest. So they take Joash and they hide him. And so he's hidden away with her in the house of Yahweh for 6 years while Athaliah is reigning over the land. So here's this young child. He's taken and he's hidden away. Well, beginning at verse 4 and going through 21, he's going to be anointed as king. Now in the 7th year of Jehoiada, sent for and took the commanders of hundreds of the Kerites and of the guard and brought them to him in the house of Yahweh. Then he cut a covenant with them and had them swear in the house of Yahweh and showed them the king's son. And he commanded them, saying, "This is the thing that you shall do. 1/3 of you who come in on the Sabbath and keep watch over the king's house. 1/3 also shall be at the gate, and 1/3 at the gate behind the guards. Shall keep watch over the house for defense. And 2 parts of you, even all who go out on the Sabbath, shall also keep watch over the house of Yahweh for the king. And you shall surround the king, each with his weapon in his hand. And whoever comes within the rank shall be put to death, and be with the king when he goes out and when he comes in." So the commanders of hundreds did according to all that Jehoiada the priest commanded. And so here they come in, and each one of them took his men who were to come in on the Sabbath with those who were to go out on the Sabbath, and they came to Jehoiada the priest. And so they're here with Joash, keeping him safe. Well, then down in verse 12, it says that he brought the king's son out and put the crown on him and gave him the testimony. And they made him king and anointed him, and they clapped their hands and said, "Long live the king." Well, then Athaliah heard the noise of the guard and of the people, and she came to the people in the house of Yahweh. And she looked, and behold, the king was standing by the pillar, according to the custom, with the commanders and the trumpeters beside the king. And all the people of the land were glad and blew trumpets. Then Athaliah tore her clothes and cried, "Treason, treason." And Jehoiada the priest commanded the commanders of hundreds who were appointed over the military force and said to them, "Bring her out between the ranks, and whoever follows her, put to death with the sword." For the priest said, let her not be put to death in the house of Yahweh. So they laid hands on her, and she arrived at the horses' entrance of the king's house and was put to death there. Then Jehoiada cut a covenant between Yahweh and the king and the people, that they would be the people of Yahweh, also between the king and the people. And all the people of the land came to the house of Baal and tore it down, his altars and his images. They broke in pieces thoroughly and killed Matan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. And the priest appointed overseers over the house of Yahweh. And he took the commanders of hundreds and the Kerites and the guards and all the people of the land, and they brought the king down from the house of Yahweh and came by way of the gate of the guards to the king's house, and he sat on the throne of the kings. So all the people of the land were glad, and the city was quiet, for they had put Athaliah to death with the sword in the king's house. Jehoash, also Joash, was 7 years old when he became king. So here, after this time that Athaliah reigned, Jehoiada the priest decides it's time for Jehoash or Joash to take his place as king. He's the one in line to be king. He's the only one left. And so they anoint him king, and they're crying out, long live the king. And Athaliah comes, and Jehoiada says to take her out as she's crying out treason, take her out and execute her, but don't execute her in the house of the Lord. So they take her out and execute her, and the people are happy. Athaliah is now gone. They destroy down everything used to worship to Baal. Now this is worship to Baal in Judah. Remember, Jehu takes care of worship in Israel. But after the intermarrying of Ahab's family with Jehoshaphat's family, it's introduced in Judah. And so what's being taken down here with Jehoiada, the priest, and all the people with Jehoiada and Joash is what was used to worship Baal in Judah, in the southern of the kingdoms. And it said in verse 21 that when Jehoash became king, he was 7 years old. He's quite young to rule as a king. But when we read about some of his early reign here in chapter 12, in the 7th year of Jehu, Jehoash became king, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Zibiah of Beersheba. And Jehoash did what was right in the sight of Yahweh all his days, in which Jehoiada the priest instructed him. Only the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. And we don't get to that this week, here in chapter 12, nor over in the part of Chronicles account we're covering this week, but that'll be dealt with more next week about ultimately the mistakes of Joash. But I think there's a statement here that we need to realize, and that is, he did what was right in the sight of the Lord all his days. In which way? Which he's instructed by Jehoiada the priest. So what this tells me something about Joash is, where was his faith? It was in Jehoiada the priest. So when Jehoiada's gone, guess what else is gone? The faith of Joash. And we'll see more about that next week in Chronicles account. But he does what's right in the sight of the Lord all the days that he is instructed by Jehoiada the priest. Now, he's repairing the temple. Jehoash says to the priest, all the money of the sacred things which is brought to the house of Yahweh, both the money for each numbered man, verse 4, the money for each person's assessment in the census, and all the money which the man's heart prompts him to bring into the house of Yahweh, let the priests take it for themselves, each from his acquaintance, and they shall repair the damages of the house wherever any damage may be found. So the goal here is to restore the damage that is made in the house of the Lord. So when they come in 9, Jehoiada the priest in verse 9 took a chest after they had some questions raised in the previous verses. We'll skip on down to 9 for time's sake. Jehoiada the priest took a chest, bored a hole in its lid, and he put it aside beside the altar on the right side as one comes into the house of Yahweh. And the priest who kept watch over the threshold put in it all the money which was brought into the house of Yahweh. And it happened when they saw that there was much money in it, in the chest, that the king's scribe and the high priest came up and tied it in bags and counted it, which was found, the money that was found in the house of Yahweh. And they gave the money which was laid out into the hands of those who did the work, who had the oversight of the house of Yahweh, and they paid it out to the craftsmen of wood and the builders who worked on the house of Yahweh, and the masons and the hewers of stone, and for buying the timber and the hewn stone to repair the damages to the house of Yahweh, and all that was laid out for the house to repair it. And so here they are repairing the damage that is done to the house of the Lord with the money that was collected there. And so that's ordered by Jehoash early in his reign, still in the life of Jehoiada, to repair the damages that have been done to the temple. We'll skip on down to 19 through 21. The rest of the acts of Joash and all that he did, are they not written in the books of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And his servants arose and made a conspiracy against him and struck down Joash at the house of Millo as he was going down to Silla. Now Jozkar the son of Shimeath and Jehozabad the son of Shomar, his servant, struck him and he died. And they buried him with his fathers in the city of David. And Amaziah his son became king in his place. And so he's struck down here in King's account. But again, next week in Chronicles account, talk more detail about the latter half of the life of Joash or Jehoash, depending on what passage you're in. This is the same stuff we've already gone through. 7 through 12 is where 2 Chronicles 22 is where Jehu kills Ahaziah. Joash is set on the throne of Judah in 1 through 11, where after Athaliah comes to the throne in verses at the very tail end of chapter 22, they make Joash king here in chapter 23 in the first 11 verses, and 12 through 14, really 12 through 15, is the execution of Athaliah. Let's talk about some practical lessons we see. We've got just a couple of minutes remaining. What are some practical lessons we see in these chapters we were in this evening? That's a good point. Obeying part of it isn't simply enough. That here he does a lot of what the Lord had told him to do, or at least early on in his reign. In those early years, he's carrying out what the Lord has told him to do, but he never fully obeyed. He's not careful to heed the words of the Lord and to follow what the Lord has said. Oh, he did part, but not all. And we've got to be careful, too, that we're not just doing part, that we're doing all of what is said. Psalm 119 talks about the sum of thy words, or all the entirety of thy words is truth. What else do we see in these chapters? We see obedience. Here we see the start of obedience. And in the case of both Jehu and Joash, we see good starts, not so good ends. And so both of them got off to good starts and were obeying early on in their reigns. And a lot of good we can learn from some of those early parts. But unfortunately, the end of it, the end of both of their reigns wasn't so good. I think we see something about the fact that God always keeps His word. Did you think about the amount of time that has passed in 1 Kings 21? Go up and add in how long Jehoram reigns in Israel, how long Ahaziah reigns in Israel, not to mention the time from Ahab and Naboth's vineyard to the time of Ahab's death. You add all that up, you've got quite a bit of time. And you know what happened? The very things that Elijah said were going to take place back there in 1 Kings chapter 21, they take place, just like he said it. And so the Lord keeps His word. When God told Elijah to tell Ahab what was going to happen, that's exactly what was going to happen. It didn't matter how much time has passed. This is a reminder to us today. It reminds me of 2 Peter 3, when some are questioning if the Lord's going to return, because over 30 years have passed now. It's probably about 67 when the book is written, so we're looking about 34 years since Christ's resurrection and ascension into heaven. And people are beginning to doubt, and that's when he points out that time means nothing. How much time passed from the promise of the flood to the flood? 120 years. That's a lot of time. That's a lot more time than what takes place right here. The Lord always keeps His word. And finally, I think we see the need to remove the sin. It wasn't enough for Jehu to just get rid of the Baal worshippers. They needed to remove any temptation for that. Tear down the house of the temple of Baal. Tear down all the places to worship him. Same thing in Judah. Remove that out of the way. This is not a problem. That's not a problem. But they have to remove that from among the people. Next week, 2 Kings 13 and 14, then 24:15 through chapter 26 of 2 Chronicles.